My name's Brian.
No! No! What in Azewth's crack is this?
This is Bare Metal. For today's video, I wanted to focus on one of my favorite subgenres, dark fantasy.
No! Ridiculous! I must send the guild a missive. Boys, the algorithm put this cauldron of hot carker on my orb. Discount Thor High Heels wants dark fantasy? Let's show him. It's brigading time.
Insert pandering cause Lovecraft was racist.
Like literally everyone alive during his time? Come on, bro! Morality points is not that important. Nah, fam, you missing the point. True dark fantasy is no-go zone for normies. It's the name of Lovecraft, cat. It is the consequence of interacting with prostitutes in medieval times and then rotting away. It is dying from infection that you got from a splinter on your finger. It is inability to fend off the plague due to lack of understanding. It is drinking mercury because some old dude stated it will make you immortal. It is sending kids to coal mines. And so much more. The moment you shine a light on it, it becomes nothing more but a phrase. Dark fantasy. And it's mixed with shit now, thanks to AI and overall influx of normies on the net.
Okay, alright, we get it. My name is Brian. This is Bare Metal. Before we get into today's video, I want to say thank you guys, sincerely. I was surprised by the overwhelmingly positive reception this channel has gotten based solely on its first video. You guys not only left a ton of encouragement and useful tips in the comments of last video to help make this channel shine, but you also gave fantastic recommendations for more dark fantasy games and media, some of which we're going to be checking out today. Keep those coming, by the way. I might not get to every recommendation in a single video, but if you mentioned it, I took note of it and it's on the list of things for me to try out, so definitely appreciate more recommendations as we go along. Obviously, I couldn't resist trolling the trolls in the comments section, so I have to give special thanks to Tunnix, one of the UK's best fantasy voice actors, for helping me do that by graciously acting out that opening skit you saw. If he sounds familiar, you may be recognizing him as one of the playable characters in Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader, and he's also done tons of other work in games, TV, trailers, and a whole lot of other stuff. So definitely check out his work, and if you're a game developer, keep Scott in mind for your next project. Now with all of that being said, back to the trolling. Are you really gonna leave all of that up to us? Remember this, if nothing else, metalheads. All you new subscribers and friendly viewers out there, we don't do echo chambers here. We do mosh pits. If you happen to spot trash down there in the comments section, be sure to kindly redirect it back to the other side of YouTube where it can find the warm and tender embrace of the Fortnite to alt-right pipeline, or whatever the Hitler Youth are playing these days. If they get in their fifis about it, then all the better. More engagement for us. Anyway, on to the good stuff. As we've already established, my first video was a little too soft and woke for the true basement-dwelling dark fantasy experts out there. Not only were the recommendations I made too mainstream for some people, but there wasn't enough rotting flesh, alcoholism, or seething resentment in the last one to make it worth sitting through. So I decided to dive back into Steam, and beyond. Came back with 5 more underrated and gritty dark fantasy titles by up-and-coming devs. Voin is an early access title on Steam that takes you into a world of sweeping landscapes, dark magic, and horrific creatures to cut through. It was first made available on December 10th, 2024, and I was surprised at how polished the game looked and felt when I picked it up. If you watched my last video, you'll probably remember the game Mortal Sin as the first one I reviewed. Well, Both of these games are actually part of the Sinful Vengeance Duo bundle on Steam, and it's pretty clear why. These games are like blood-soaked peas in a fleshy pod, with gruesome first-person combat and distinct visual styling taking center stage in both. The hack-and-slash focus of the games is perhaps the closest similarity, with limb dismemberment being a key mechanic in their combat.
See this like a preview for what it's about to be like.
Otherwise, these games are fairly distinct and will appeal to different tastes. Mortal Sin definitely plays like more of what you would think of when you think of an indie title. It's a bit more jagged, restrictive, and unrefined, whereas Voin feels like it was put together by a full team. In the language of Candlemass album covers, since you guys loved that reference last time, if Mortal Sin is the gauche and sludgy minimalism of Epicus Doomicus Metallicus, then Voin is like an Ancient Dreams, a more sweeping and cinematic take on the same subgenre. If you just handed them to me and told me that Voin was a higher budget studio sequel or a spiritual successor to Mortal Sin, there's a chance I'd believe you. The fact that one person seems to have created this world is insane, because this game beats out some things made by bigger teams, like, remember the original Lords of the Fallen? The one they try to pretend doesn't exist? Never existed? Remember how awful that was? Yeah, this is way better than what that entire team tried to make back then. But beyond that, Voin really goes the extra mile to cater to your experiences and preferences in ways that a lot of cash grab AAA titles fail to. Just as an example, opening up the game gives you the option to choose between modern graphics and a pixelated overlay that gives a more retro look. I played around with both of these options and didn't feel it had a huge impact on my experience, but then I decided to turn it all the way down. Like all the way down. And boy, was that something. On its own, without the filter, this game is very pretty to look at, and I'm glad I chose to leave that setting off. There's a kind of pulpy, half-tone styling that the game has that makes it feel like an old novel cover or a game manual. Think Vermis, but something actually playable. I had a couple of moments when I was just walking through this open world and I wanted to stop and just take in the landscape as much as I could. The zones you have to navigate are both spacious and dense, so there's a lot of intricate detailing to make each area feel unique and worth exploring every inch of. Voin does a really good job of pulling off scale and scope, and I was surprised to find an interior that felt as seamless and immersive as the open outside zones. When I did explore the wider world, I found myself looking up to marvel at the scale of buildings and mountains and structures more than once. This game actually encourages a lot of exploration, to the point where I was surprised that I could not only keep going if I headed in a certain direction, but that there would be more enemies or rewards waiting for me if I kept pushing those boundaries. It was only after I got way off the unbeaten path that the game politely guided me back in the right direction.
Are we sightseeing now? Your destiny awaits elsewhere.
So that basically covers the looks of the game, but let's get a little more technical. I completed about 3 or 4 zones in my first 2 hours, and it felt like I was barely scratching the surface of what this game has to offer. When you actually get into the gameplay, it's easy to move the sticks around, swing a couple times, and chalk this up to being another Souls-like, since this is the newest lazy trend for developers and players and retailers. But after actually spending a little bit of time in the world, interacting with all of the different mechanics that keep this game going, I would caution against rushing to that conclusion. One of my complaints about a couple other first-person games that sell themselves as Souls-likes for some reason is how burdensome the combat can feel sometimes. Indie devs seem to have trouble making combat feel smooth and intuitive when you're in first person, but I have to say that this game largely pulls it off. Sword-based combat feels really good, and while I didn't feel the same about all the other weapons that I encountered, even the starter sword was really satisfying to use. You start off with a right bumper, right trigger combat system for light, heavy, and special attacks. Later on, you can unlock special abilities with collectibles called Motes of Power. For my run, I went with a long-range thrust, which actually ended up having a few benefits outside of combat as well. Just ask your mother. There's a rune-based augmentation system, which can give you unique buffs or abilities once you assign it to your character. There are some exceptions, like when you pick up a mace or a club, and you get this goofy-ass running animation, or try to fight multiple enemies, and it just doesn't work out. There are 7 or 8 enemy types that I encountered in my runs, not including boss fights, Some are fast, some are tanky, some are just cannon fodder, so your mileage may vary. But some weapons do seem to have a bit more flexibility and grace than others, and not in a way that feels intentional. And this is a roguelite in the sense that the areas you navigate will typically remain the same each run, but you'll need to fight your way back to your death location if you want to get most of your items back. One fun little part of this that I haven't seen before is that wherever you die, you'll leave behind a big old spinny meat piñata that you have to whack until everything you own falls out. So these are your hurdles, and you can strategize around the obstacles and limitations after a little bit, even if your weapon set isn't working out. You have other resources and recourses for combat. For instance, this game does not have fall damage, it just doesn't exist. Instead, you do damage to enemies with a lightning-based area of effect attack if you jump from high enough. You can also gain passive abilities like duplicates, which will jump into combat to attack enemies on your behalf when you meet a certain condition. Oftentimes, you can even bait enemies into helping you meet those conditions, giving you more control over when and how these effects are activated. That is combat in a nutshell, and there's a lot more that I haven't had the chance to explore myself, so I'm definitely itching to return to it. The weak point of this game, I have to say, seems to be the narrative. That may simply be because I haven't played long enough to get invested in our hero's story, but I didn't really care who I was or what the end goal might look like. I was just chopping that meat, having a good old time. Here's what I know of the story. You play the thrall of some magical overlord, and you are fighting to... That's it. That's the extent of my knowledge. Maybe you're trying to discover your truest self, or cleanse the world of gods and monsters, or just collect cool things. Maybe you want to make Sky Daddy happy so he doesn't kill you. It's unclear, and we only get brief bits of dialogue from our deific puppet master once or twice in each zone. And you know what? That's fine. At no point did I ever feel like I needed the story to push me forward. Entering into a new realm and feeling an urge to explore every nook and cranny of it actually ended up being enough to take me to the final boss every time. And I never felt like I exhausted everything. If anything, I wanted to backtrack and venture into the opposite direction to find things I may have missed the first time around. I had a blast with this game, and I'm really impressed with it so far considering the little I know. I'm ready to put in a few dozen more hours having wrapped up my first session, and I think if you're in the market for a traditional first-person experience with the occasional little twist and surprise, Voin will not disappoint you.
Behind you.
Of Love and Eternity is an upcoming horror adventure game by Winston Powell, aka Acorn Bringer. It's currently in demo state. It's gloomy, dreary, and macabre, letting you take on the perspective of a knight trapped between life and death, and who seeks to reunite with his lover who has met a similar fate. I spent a while trying to figure out how to best describe this game in a way that really captures its essence. I figured that the best way to show you is to show you, so I'll let the opening scene speak for itself.
brave knight, whose love is true and eternal, whose fate was cruel and untimely. The grip of a malevolent force on your soul has loosened. Your killer is dead. Betrayed you, and it was some time before your soul found this body once again. Life was taken in a most unnatural way, ripped from your body and left to wander the void. Your beloved has suffered equally so. Beyond is a world of the damned, and the souls who stray are lost. Beyond dwell violent and wicked spirits that have long been abandoned, and those who wish to see you join them. Beyond is where you will go. Beyond, she searches for you.
In its current playable state, Of Love and Eternity is very much cinematic and atmospheric in this way. The game relies on environmental storytelling, one-liners, and brief cutscenes to paint a picture of the person you were and are trying to become again. For that reason, the game can come off as very slow and meandering, and I don't mean that in a bad way. If you've played Death Stranding or seen the movie The Green Knight, you know that there's a kind of long, step-by-step journey that goes along with the narrative in those things. After a while, the lingering pace becomes the point. This game definitely seems to be aiming for a similar player experience here. You're trudging along, purposefully, and almost getting lost in these beckoning liminal spaces. It needs to be slow, and it needs you to feel every moment. That means that this game is not for people who want a fast-paced, action-oriented experience in its current state, but that could change. You can punch, but as of right now, there's nothing to punch in-game. It just exists to make a button do something. And despite the slowness, it really is a fantastic immersive experience, one that I'm excited to revisit once the game is done. Of Love and Eternity is great at creating atmosphere. There's really strong sound design, and there's some timing on scripted events that happen that feels immaculate. I'd be navigating through the woods and all of a sudden there would be a glow or a figure in the distance or something new that would make me stop in my tracks and reframe my entire experience up to that point. There were a couple of moments where I felt like I was in one of those cornball ARG-tuber videos where they put on their spooky voice to talk about found footage or lost media. Okay, not actually, but you know what I'm saying. The visuals here rely a lot on dithering and contrast to help set the mood. That's usually a shadowy and grim one, but the game will surprise you with moments of sudden, vivid coloration, moments that cut through the dark like a lightning bolt. I wasn't a huge fan of the overlay at first, but when you actually begin to walk through the world that the developer is setting up for you here, it gives an almost impressionistic look, one that feels really in line with the overall experience. If you find that it's not for you, then you can turn it off in the settings in the main menu. The soundtrack is mostly ambient and natural, with a few breaks into music every now and then. Overall, I think it's great and carries the tone of the game really well. Considering how little of this there is to play so far, I think its ability to use all of these elements as tools to put you in this world and feel lost and uncertain just like the main character is a testament to the creator's talent. Now, I'm getting ahead of myself. This game isn't even in early access, so of course I was doomed to run into a couple of hiccups, like some navigation problems that nearly boosted me into the abyss, and the same old camera clipping and general jank that pretty much every video game has. But for a title with 30 minutes or so of gameplay to show off, it's really impressive, and I can't wait to see more. If you find yourself a little less invested in trying out this game because it's in a demo state right now, just be aware that as I write this script, the last Patreon update is on December 10th. So yeah, development is ongoing, and let's see, we've got a Discord, Blue Sky, and itch.io page where you can get updates from the developer himself. I'll be keeping an eye on everything, and it's looking good so far, Winston. Don't screw it up. Since we're on the topic of game demos, I wanted to check out Verho, another first-person action-adventure title available to try for free on Steam. The story takes place in a world in which anyone who sees the face of another person causes the death of both. Obviously, this leads to the destruction of much of humanity and the dispersal and isolation of its survivors. The game takes place 600 years later, and the exact details of how humanity managed to persist that long remain a mystery. The one clue to the story of humanity's survival is in people's present reliance on masks. You choose your own at the beginning of the game, and every character you come across wears one as well. The narrative follows your journey as you begin to explore this world and put together the pieces of the past, learning what happened and trying to forge an identity for yourself. This game is pretty cool. It's inspired by Kingsfield and Lunacid, which, don't worry guys, I know, I'm covering next, just bear with me. But there's also more than a hint of Zelda influence here, specifically the turn-of-the-century titles like Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. And of course, everything out right now reeks of Dark Souls influence, and this game is no exception. It's another one of them hyphen-likes, but mostly in the sense of having central hubs, checkpoints, and shortcuts. Calling it a Souls-like in any other way is kind of a stretch, and it instead feels more like a traditional first-person RPG. I mentioned Zelda before, and I think a lot of developers worked really hard to recapture the feeling of those 5th and early 6th gen games. A lot of people who make things like this want you to not just get nostalgic, but really feel like you're playing those titles again for the first time. And I have to say, not many of them can pull it off, but Verho does. See, this is a game that tries to do a lot with only a handful of assets. Everything from textures to enemies to game mechanics are kept straightforward and minimalistic. And that actually ends up being the key to recreating the feeling of something that you'd boot up on a PlayStation, N64, or Dreamcast. This game pulls off Banjo-Kazooie, Turok, Jet Force Gemini levels of low poly blur and repetition. And that works for a game that wants to recall that era. And again, I tried really hard to think of another title that managed to pull off that same nostalgic effect for this specific era. There was only one, and it was a 2016 remaster that went relatively unnoticed. It was the first ever collaboration between Elden Ring publisher From Software and Naughty Dog, who you may remember as the developer of The Last of Us series. Despite the high-profile backing and development accolades of both of these companies, the title got very little attention, largely because of its lo-fi, unprofessional look and feel. And that game is the character action role-playing behemoth, Robotron 64. That's right, goddammit, it's back. It's back, it's a running bit, and it'll never stop. You'll never stop me. There are only a couple of enemy types in Verho so far, and as you progress, many of the quote-unquote new ones will actually just be variations of a standard type that you've already encountered in the first half of the demo. I had a bit of a slow and grindy start fighting against them all, but that was on me. You have a lot of class presets to choose from in the introduction, and in order to get a real feel for everything, I decided to go with the Forgotten Mask. This one sets all of your stats to 1, so you have to find a build that works as you play. It took a while, but once I'd found a weapon that did a decent amount of damage and matched my playstyle, I found combat to be pretty satisfying. Every area was small, but felt like it took a fair amount of time to explore. And the atmosphere building is better in some areas than others, but when this game hits, man, does it hit. In places like the temple or the ruins, you're met with eerie, ambient soundscapes and unfamiliar or intimidating enemy types. You can tell a lot of thought went into what this looks, sounds, and feels like. But everything you've heard so far has been the spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down. And here's the medicine. This game has pretty mid voice acting.
Newcomer, if I were you, I'd be careful. Entering the cave without a light source is suicide. I mean, there are also incredible treasures in there that you'd surely want to get your hands on. I won't stop you from trying, but if you die in there, I'll claim everything you have in your pockets.
It's probably my least favorite part of Verho as it exists. It is a game that sounds like a Skyrim mod with crowdsourced dialogue, so it's not something I'd want to pay for in the long run. A lot of the performances are really good, but the performances of the actors are pretty quickly undermined when you realize that all of these people probably recorded their lines in different locations with a motley of equipment. And you only have to listen to like 2 people to catch on to that. Massive jumps in volume, recordings that sound tinny or low fidelity, and just overall inconsistency in tone and quality really press on the wound to remind you that this is an amateur project.
Say, are you planning to die? Because you look like someone who's headed there quickly. I discovered the truth. I held in my hands the key to banishing the Wraith. Sorry, I haven't been myself lately.
And I do get that audio is hard, and I mean, just listen to this channel. It does not have the perfect audio quality. A lot of people just really don't care about that kind of thing, but it broke my immersion when I was playing. Voice acting in games, to me, is just one of those things I think you can't half-ass. I don't think anyone would mind if it wasn't voiced, or if it was voiced really well, but it's in this weird in-betweenish space that I think detracts from the interesting character designs and intricate lore of this world, which it seems like a lot of work went into. Like, look at this guy.
Greetings, small human.
Look how cool this is.
I am Parentius, smith of this village.
I'm flabbergasted. And to be very fair, I know this is a demo, I know it's still cooking, but the midness seems to extend to all areas of the game in some form or fashion. And that might sound mean, but consider this little anecdote I have from my playthrough. Once you finally make it to what is effectively the end of the demo and get the sword you've been teased with for a couple hours, there's a typo in the description. The description is less than 10 words. The misspelled word is of. Come on, dude, really? This is the big payoff of your game as it exists, and you couldn't even be bothered to get another pair of eyes on a 2-letter word? That was how I felt in the moment, and it was a real momentum killer for me. And the only reason I bring it up is because I do think this game could be the first iteration of something very special. Verho has the making of a modern classic, and I'm excited to see what else this developer does, both for this title and for future ones. But it'll only get there if they put in the actual time and work to make it a quality piece. Every gem needs to be polished if you want to make it shine. Sorry if that seemed too negative. I mean, I'm not sorry, but I think you should definitely try this out, and maybe you'll like it as it is. But if you feel the same way that I do, wishlist it, leave a review, and show the developer some love, even if it's tough love. I'd definitely be interested in seeing what Verho looks like in a perfect world with more support and more resources, and there's still a chance to make that happen. My recent experiences with Lunacid give me some great insight into what that future version of Verho could look like, especially considering that it's listed as one of Verho's direct inspirations. Lunacid is a game a couple of you guys recommended to me off the back of Dread Delusion in the last video, and the two actually share the Acid Fantasy bundle on Steam, but I don't think they could be any different. It's developed by an indie game studio under the direction of one Akuma Kira, and unlike Dread Delusion, Lunacid isn't an overly psychedelic experience despite what its name might imply. Kira prefers grit and grind. And the result is a game that drives home the same feelings that a lot of survival horror classics rely on to keep you both engaged and at the edge of your seat. An important bit of context to have when you're learning about this game is that Kira is no stranger to the horror genre, but instead Lunacid appears to be one of the studio's first forays into the traditional RPG format, which is kind of cool because it's a really fun RPG too. Combat feels pretty good, I'd say on par with your average first-person fantasy game, and above par with most of the indie titles I've covered so far. It's smooth and intuitive, and while most of its mechanics fall into your typical sword and sorcery bucket, I'd still argue that this game gets more of its DNA from a Silent Hill or a Resident Evil than anything else. While a lot of games give you flexibility in how you want to experience the narrative and setting, Kira instead has the amazing ability to dictate the exact tone and terms of each location that you visit. And while some zones are relatively light and peaceful, others are downright ghoulish and unforgiving in their atmosphere. Part of how the game seems to accomplish this is in its fantastic sound design. While a huge portion of the music in Lunacid could fall into an Avith Ortega would-be Silent Hill album, or Haircuts for Men playlist, in transitional areas the game will often slip into silence for long periods before springing back into a darker, eerier soundtrack. It makes it clear that you're no longer in a safe or familiar location. Instead, you're veering into danger. And a few sound effects sprinkled in will frequently remind you you're somewhere you're not supposed to be. But another way the game creates this sense of unease is by setting your expectations with the gameplay and then immediately subverting them. For instance, in one location I stumbled into, my health was fairly low, and I was on edge after dealing with some enemies that seemed to be more of a threat than I'd anticipated. so when I came across some rats, I killed them with the expectation that they would attack me when given a chance. I went further through the zone and started to encounter more of them. I realized that they weren't actually harming me at all. In fact, they were just running up to me, just hanging out, and they'd squeak and run off. And then I noticed something even weirder. If I didn't move, they'd run back to me. And if I started to take a couple of steps, they'd do the same, running ahead of me. They were leading me somewhere, so I followed them all around the area until I stumbled across a false wall, and they brought me inside to find a couple of items that would help me on my journey. I thought that was pretty cool. I felt a little bad for straight up schmurdering their friends. Well, I shouldn't have, because when I entered the next zone, I encountered more of them. I was hoping they'd lead me to an exit, but these ones didn't seem as interested in befriending or guiding me. Instead, they led me to new enemy types that I was unprepared for: high damage rat kings and huge and aggressive rat queens. Another moment that stood out to me was when I found the catacombs, where most of the enemies didn't respond at all to physical damage or magic-based attacks. I knew this, but I decided to rough it anyway, and after making more than a few wrong turns, I got confronted and chased by an army of horrifying, disembodied horse-head spirits. I was nearly dead after getting cornered by most of them, but I managed to make my way into a room with a unique weapon mounted on the wall: the Vampire Hunter's Sword. I grabbed it and scurried back to a checkpoint where I thought I'd be safe and that everything would respawn back where it started in Dark Souls fashion. That did not happen. But with the game saved and my newfound sword at my side, I was able to revisit all of the areas I'd been to prior and clear out the ghosts and skeletons that kept me from progressing before. The game is full of little moments like this where you'll have to break out of a specific mindset before you even really have a chance to settle into it, and that is perhaps the trippiest part of Lunacid and what makes it such a special experience. In short, it's a game full of pros, and while there aren't that many cons, there are one or two things that I'm kind of on the fence about with this game. First, there is a ton of customization for visual settings in the game to make it look however you, the player, want. If you want to be in a vaporwave music video, or playing a VHS tape Hotline Miami style, or back in 1999 playing Silent Hill on a CRT, all of these settings exist for you, which I think is a fun little detail. But no matter how much you tinker with these settings, there's one thing you can't change, which is the goddamn screen tearing overlay that the game activates every time you move or look around. I despise it. At least on my display it's kind of annoying, and it took me like an hour to learn to ignore. And this, combined with the automatic camera movement that is enabled by default, can give you motion sickness and make you want to vomit on your computer just to end it all. But at the very least, you can disable this camera movement. I just don't know why. These effects are here to begin with, considering how little they add to the game and how much they distract from it. One thing I'm also uncertain about, but not necessarily mad at, is the characters and the dialogue. While everything is well written, character voices aren't really voices. Instead, you get these endearing little babbles that land somewhere between Banjo-Kazooie and Animal Crossing, and while I do like it, tonally, it's just so much different from the rest of what you encounter that I don't know how to feel about it. If you're looking for something dark, then that is definitely a pebble in the shoe that you can either easily ignore or that will be a deal breaker for you, depending on your tolerance for goof and vibe overlap, but overall, I'd say it's much better than having to deal with the Verho problem. In spite of me complaining about these small details, Lunacid is probably one of the best indie games I've played in a really long time, so while I've got a lot of other things on my list of games to try out for 2025, this one will definitely be high up on there. Thank you to all of the folks who put this on my radar. I forget which one of you guys recommended this game to me, but I have to say, you must have been smoking on that dank yaya when you scooted up to that keyboard. I don't know what kind of Pulaski County Scooby snack you've been nibbling on, but I swear to all that is good and sober in this world that you need an intervention before whatever twisted god made your drug of choice decides to swoop back down to earth and lace it with anything that could possibly bring you back to the horror of reality that you must have created for yourself. Oh, it was you. Thank you for the recommendation. So, obviously, after a lot of deliberation, I decided to include Felvidek last on the list. This is a turn-based alternate history RPG set in 15th century Slovakia. You play Powell, a knight with a penchant for the bubbly, who gets sucked into a whirlwind of strange, otherworldly occurrences when he notices a building exploding in the distance from his bedroom window. Some of the most pressing missions on the way to figure out what happened include hunting down biscuits and herbs to keep a knight from shitting himself to death because your estranged wife poisoned him, using the village dog to track down a thief in your underwear because they stole all of your belongings with the help of a horrifying mouthman, trying to steal pear wine from the village outcast, falling from a tree in the process, cracking your head on the ground, and waking up in his house to find his conjoined daughters wondering who the hell you are and what is wrong with you. Slipping from the warm embrace of night into a Harry Dubois hangover to find a horrible clam-faced barbarian standing over your bed and fending him off by chucking a wine goblet at his face. And so much more. I'm sure I don't have to go into too much more detail to explain that this game has a bizarre and unserious tone that floats somewhere between the absurdist humor of Disco Elysium and the downright nonsensical flurry of notions and feelings that is Hylix. It is so weird and goofy that it makes me cast a bit of a sideways glance at anyone who might call it dark fantasy. And I think the absurdity of everything is compounded by the fact that you have to parse through 15th century dialogue that dips in and out of Slovakian. All of it is given a weird Coen-esque coloration by these odd characters who the game really wants you to find funny and quirky even when they're not. Go ahead and slap a folk, funk, and noise rock soundtrack on top of that and you have what I can only describe as the downright strangest and least immersive video game experience I have ever had. At no point did I ever entirely understand what the hell I was playing. I don't even know if it necessarily qualifies as dark fantasy. There are monsters and some of them have interesting designs, but I never looked at them and thought, this terrifies me to my core. It was usually, look at this goddamn goofball of a mob. Now, deep breath. I know some of you guys are so sponsorship brained that the idea of giving an honest review of a video game without glazing it to hell and back is unfathomable. But this game is here because someone recommended it, and while I tried it and don't love it for me, I do admit that it has a lot of interesting moments. And I think it's weird and unique enough that somebody out there will be able to appreciate it in ways I just don't think I can. Or want to try to, frankly. All jokes aside, I was never having a blast with what I was playing at any point. Turn-based RPGs aren't usually my thing to begin with, so the gameplay didn't earn any brownie points. I turned off my computer with more questions about the developers than I had about the game, but not really any desire or reason to pursue answers about either. It was just a big old shrug all around for the most part. But there is one thing that this game does really well. Once you start it, it plants a little tiny nagging seed of curiosity in your skull. You want to know what comes next. You want to know why this guy's wife left him and is poisoning people. You want to know who these cultists and killers and creatures are. These wants become a need to know what's really happening beneath the pale and grungy facade of this game. I was mesmerized by that exact feeling once I'd gotten into it. Not groundbreaking gameplay, not stellar writing, not a life-changing experience, just pure narrative curiosity. They got me, it hooked me, and I can absolutely see why someone would burn a day or two on this game, but I think that it'll probably be a while before that person ends up being me. I do believe that feeling of wonder will be enough for a lot of people seeing this now, and I hope that if that is you, you go all the way through with it and tell the rest of us what the hell we're looking at here. So I may have lied, Felvidek was going to be last on the list, but I decided to give you guys a little bonus for sticking around until the end of the video. This is something for people who might be interested in a looser, gritty dark fantasy vibe, rather than any kind of long-form experience. A slight detour on the way: if you're a subscriber or a returning viewer, you may have noticed the new title cards in this video. They are a bit different from the ones in the first one. My buddy DrTomoki helped design those, so shout out to him for all of his hard work helping me make this a much better channel than it was a few weeks ago. Dr. T also introduced me to a site I hadn't been on before, itch.io, which is home to a ton of free and low-priced indie games made by small teams and solo creators. So while looking around on there this past month, I came across the work of a dev who goes by Warkus. This person has been working on the upcoming survival horror game House of Necrosis, and that doesn't seem to be anything too crazy, just good old-fashioned RE-style survival horror. There is a page for it on Steam with a trailer if you're interested, and it looks like they're still actively working on it, at least as of December 2024. I think there was a demo or a playable teaser available at some point on itch, but it has since been taken down, and while that means I can't show off too much here on the channel, I was able to find something smaller that Warkus worked on that I think might be an indicator of how dark and jarring the upcoming project might be if we're lucky. It's called Chalicebound, and it's a 2D point-and-click adventure that cites 80s classic Shadowgate as well as Vermis as inspirations. Now, I've made a couple of breadcrumb mentions of both Vermis and Fear and Hunger in these first two videos already, because they've already been platformed a lot on YouTube, and I think it gives a good reference point for a lot of the things that I'm talking about here. And having experienced both of those things for myself, I honestly think that they're going to pave the way for a lot of new creators who want to make dark, eerie, or esoteric content, for better or for worse. It's still pretty early to expect anything to come out of that, but Chalicebound seems to be one of the best examples of what that next wave of dark fantasy might look like, at least tonally. It's not a full game, and what exists only took about 15 minutes for me to get through, but it's definitely an interesting little experience and one that's worth playing through, if only to familiarize yourself with the work of one of today's indie creators in the genre. So if you, like me, have been watching this little corner of the dark fantasy world with great interest, then this is for you. Without further ado, please enjoy a brief playthrough of Chalicebound by Warkus. Alright folks, that's all for today's video. Hopefully this one will keep you all distracted while I work on the next 2 or 3, which likely to someone's disappointment out there will not be focused on dark fantasy. Come on, did you think I'd stay on that forever? It's bare metal, not bare Magic the Gathering. I haven't even touched on the big robots yet. And I want to touch on them. I'll be doing some video essays on a couple of individual titles and roundups in other genres before returning to this one, so keep the recommendations coming, but just know that it'll be a little longer before I cover those if they're dark fantasy. You may or may not have seen my channel announcement. There's no upload schedule in case you missed that. I'm shooting for a video or 2 per month at this rate, and I have other things I want to accomplish outside of this, so just be patient. I'll make sure it's worth the wait. If you're new here, thanks for watching. If you're returning, thanks for coming back, and if you're leaving for good, then good riddance. No room for trash here. Now remember, don't scare them too bad. Just piss them Lovecraft Nazis off a little. Enough to get them to leave a comment so we can rack up that engagement and reach the people we actually want.